On March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 disappearance vanished from the skies with 239 people on board. The Boeing 777 departed Kuala Lumpur for Beijing, but less than an hour into the flight, it disappeared from radar. No distress call, no confirmed explanation. Despite massive international searches, MH370 remained one of the greatest aviation mysteries of our time. Well, today we are joined by Christine Negroni, an award-winning aviation journalist and author of The Crash Detectives. She has spent years studying aviation disasters and investigating the clues surrounding MH370, offering a theory that challenges some of the commonly accepted narratives. Today we look at the evidence, the unanswered questions, and what may have really happened that night. Well, I'm Tony Sweet with Truth Be Told. Welcome to the Truth Be Told studios for the first time, award-winning author Christine Negroni. Well, I am excited because the one and only, the legendary Christine Negroni is here with us, and I have to say we've just passed the anniversary of this mystery of MH370. I remember when it happened. I remember all the search parties, and it just never got discovered. So there's been, with Truth Be Told, we've had conspiracy theories. We've had a lot of the mysteries around it. And one thing that you do is you work with some of the most notorious investigative crashes that we've ever had, and I'm excited to have you here to talk about this anniversary.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. I appreciate talking about this accident to people who have to understand how big and broad ranging and how many threads there are to it.
Sure.
I don't think that we're going to get. I was going to say, I don't think we're going to get another accident like this in a while, but then again, there's Air India 171, which I think probably is also a big puzzle. So,
right.
I oftentimes will say at the beginning, people will call me up from various, television stations or magazines and say, well, right after an accident, and I'll say, well, this one's not going to be a mystery for long. And then I said that about Air India 171. And then, of course, boy, was I wrong. So I oftentimes get it wrong initially. I try not to get it wrong 10 years later. By then, I feel like I've seen what's out there. I've had a chance to analyze what's out there. And in the case of Malaysia 370, I think my book stands the test of time in that here we are 10 years after the crash, and the theory is still probably the most acceptable theory by people who want to get at the facts, as opposed to going after emotional but unsupported theories like, pilot suicide and that sort of thing. So whatever you want to ask me, here I am, just shoot.
Well, what I think I'll start with is because so many people, like you said, have these theories and they focus on what happened after the disappearance from radar. But you really emphasized the earlier cockpit events. Why is that? Well,
certainly in any accident, the event, the event, the final event is to some respect, the least important event.
Right.
Because what you want to know is what is the chain that took you there, and I'd say another part of that is, I think a lot of people might think the chain that took you there starts, from pushback at the gate. And it's, of course, that's not true either. I mean, you go back to what happened to that airplane in previous flights? What happened to that airplane in its last inspection? What happened to that airplane, the last time that something was pulled off to have maintenance? And so every airplane accident is what they call an unbroken chain of events.
Right.
Small things that individually might not amount to anything, but when put together piece after piece after piece, then actually does show you the unbroken chain and how it wound up the way it did. So yeah, this story began long before Malaysia 370 pushed back from the gate, and long before, 7 hours before it actually ended up in the Indian Ocean.
And as an investigative reporter and an author of many crashes over the years, where do you start? Because I think back to like Colombo and all these what was the English lady that solved all these mysteries. Because there's
yes, I know who you mean.
Angela Lansbury.
Agatha Christie, right? Agatha Christie is who we're talking about.
That kind of that.
Right.
So you're really a detective in some ways, not just an investigator. Where do you start? Because what do you feel is the most important aspect of doing this investigation?
Well, it's an interesting question. And when in our previous exchange, when I said, you go back to the plane, but in fact, you really do go farther back, because as an investigator who now works only with public information.
Right.
Because I am essentially an armchair investigator now. I worked for a law firm for 8 years when we had access to information that the general public did not, and our investigations could be more direct and faster because we had access to information. But since I have gone out on my own, I can say that everything I learn has to come from really what's available publicly, unless somebody talks to me, and people do. But that's another story. But just generally speaking, the fact of the matter is, one of the most important questions I ask is, where have we seen this kind of event before? When has this happened? When have we seen this kind of event on this kind of airplane? When have we seen a kind of event in which the behavior of the pilots is like this? When do we see an airplane that shows no signs of anything wrong with it disappearing or coming to harm? So you really want to find out. In the great picture of aviation accidents, where are the similarities? Because sometimes aviation investigators say, and I find it to be mostly true, there's no such thing as a new accident.
Right.
Every accident has its predecessor. And it may not be an accident. It might have been an incident. It might have been a warning kind of event in which everybody landed, the plane landed safely, but there was something noted, that this plane did this and it shouldn't have done it. So that's where I begin, is where have we seen it before? And then, of course, we take all the threads of what comes in. What was the previous maintenance on the airplane? What were the pilots? How accomplished were the pilots? How familiar were they with this particular airplane? Because an amazingly good pilot, as I talk about in the Crash Detectives, a pilot with tens of thousands of hours in the air can actually get on a new airplane and make a big mistake. And that's it's characterized in a accident in Canada many years ago, in which the pilot, who was extremely experienced, made an error in figuring out how much fuel needed to go on the airplane, and the plane ran out of fuel.
That would definitely be a one that you don't want to have a mistake
exactly.
on. Yeah.
But when I interviewed him about that accident, he said to me, well, that was the first fly-by-wire aircraft. And by fly-by-wire, we really mean planes that are going from analog pulleys, switches, mechanics to electronic, digital, computerized functions. And this was the 767, and it was one of the first fly-by-wire aircraft that Boeing had created. So this pilot said to me, until I got on the 767, what I knew about a computer was using my Bank of Canada ATM card. So that's how you see, and this is and he did an amazing job landing that airplane with no fatalities, frankly. He's a hero, but he was confounded by a change in technology. And I will say, Tony, that as we look at accidents that are happening now, we really need to zero in on that, because we are at a sort of a cusp in aviation in which X percentage, I'm not going to guess how many, but X percentage of the pilots who are flying today are what they call stick and rudder pilots. They learned to fly in a little Piper Cub, and they did everything on analog gauges.
Right.
And X% are folks who grew up with digital phones and computers and computer games, and for them the electronic computerized part of the airplane is not baffling. And so we are at the cusp when we're transitioning from seat of the pants to fly by wire, and we are getting accidents in that mix as we are in the transition.
Wow.
This is a little bit off point from Malaysia.
No.
Sorry to say, I just took a side path. Sorry.
For most people like myself, it's good because we don't know the ins and outs of the crashes. All we see is what we see either in the water or in the land, and what we hear on the news. So it's good that you explain that.
Well, if I can add to that, then, since
Sure.
you're encouraging me to digress, if I can add to that, I'll say that same situation exists among air accident investigators.
Really?
X percentage of them are engineers and specialists in avionics or whatever, and X percentage of them are newer in, and they are also more familiar with technology. So when an accident investigation happens, and a good example of that is when JAL, when the two Japanese carriers that were operating the Boeing 787, and those batteries first started, going where they shouldn't have gone.
Right.
The investigators had a very hard time with that because they didn't have people who were specialists in essentially electromechanics, and there's another term for it. I'm sorry, I can't place it right now. But this battery technology on the 787 was brand new. Wasn't on any other aircraft at the time. So they had to go out and find people. These are people who were used to traditional kinds of equipment on an airplane, and this was new. So this is going to happen also in the investigation aspect of it.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that, because that's important. I think as this discussion, we get it further into this discussion. One thing I know that, like I said, I use the detectives, trying to solve a murder. In a lot of cases, it's very similar, because with the murder, the one thing you always hear, we don't have the smoking gun, meaning the knife, the gun. We don't know if we can tie this person to, or even a situation to the event. Well, most crashes, we have the airplane, we have the black box, we have possible survivors, more than likely not. But with Malaysia 370, there was a disappearance. We don't have anything. We don't have a black box. We don't have survivors. We don't even have hardly any recordings other than right before it was switched off. How do you approach that when it comes to versus, a physical crash and we have leftovers?
Right. I hear what you're saying, and it is somewhat uncommon. It is not unprecedented. And that, from the very beginning, when the Malaysians were saying, there's never been anything like this before, that's just not true. That's flat out demonstrably
you would know.
Not true. Okay, maybe they didn't know that. I get it. But in the case of not having the body, which is your parallel with the detectives, that murder investigations are solved without the body if they can essentially have enough evidence to show that the person is dead. Maybe their clothes are found somewhere, or their car is found, in a lake, or blah blah blah. And we do have that. We not only know this plane crashed because it didn't arrive where it should be, but we also have those pieces of clothes. Because we have wreckage. And not only do we have wreckage where we believed it should be. So in that respect, some of these theories that the plane was flown up to Kazakhstan,
I've heard that,
Diego Garcia, we know those can't be true. We know that because the evidence shows this airplane is in the South Indian Ocean, and its wreckage washed off exactly where. I mean, I don't want to blow my own horn, but in my book, I ask the investigators, why are you not getting in a small airplane and flying the coast of East Africa? Because we know the wreckage is going to wind up there. And it's in my book, and the investigator at the time said to me, the boss said, what would we gain from that?
Wow.
And then there we are, probably, I can't tell you, it's dated in the book, but within months of the book coming out, what happens but pieces of wreckage wash up on the shore in Madagascar. And this wreckage is useful. And the wreckage is useful. So now here's how we get to the murder investigation part.
Right.
I might have sailed a little bit astray with that, but when they found this piece of the wing that is responsible for controlling the aircraft, controlling lift on the aircraft, the airfoil, the investigators in France discovered two things. They discovered that it was stowed. It was not deployed.
Oh, wow.
In other words, it was inside the wing. It was not in a position to land. So that's interesting, because one of the theories was that the pilots had tried to slow the airplane and make a soft ditch so that they would, fly farther. I don't remember what their justification for that theory was. Fly farther or sink intact so there'd be no wreckage, whatever the reason was. But this was a theory that was given plenty of credibility in the documentaries in Australia, and it's been written about. But we know that didn't happen.
Wow.
I mean, at some point you have to say, look, we don't have everything, but we do have a lot of stuff. And in the Crash Detectives, I do talk about a lot of things that we do have that are, in my opinion, red flags. They're things that need to be investigated further. So we have the wreckage, and we have at least 20 pieces at last count, the 20 pieces of wreckage. So when a lot of these people who say we'll never know what happened to this airplane because we'll never get the airplane, that's nonsense. You can know what happened by going to the source of the information, which is the airline, the manufacturer, and look and see, when have we had similar events happen? And in that case, and my theory pins largely on similar events in which the airplane is flying fine, but we don't hear from the pilots. And there are many events, including ones very, very much like what happened to Malaysia 370, in which the plane is fine, but the pilots are incapacitated because the plane has lost pressurization. And so that's my theory in a peanut shell, because there's a lot more than that. But one of the sort of supporting pillars of that theory comes right out of the maintenance records of this airplane, which is right prior to that flight. The oxygen tanks, that the tanks that supply oxygen to the pilots in case of an emergency, an emergency need, a loss of pressurization, were serviced. So they were taken off the aircraft, serviced in the hangar, brought back to the aircraft, and reinstalled. And so, they say the most dangerous time to fly a plane or take your car out is right after it comes out of the mechanic, right?
Right. True.
So, and of course, I'm not saying it's the most dangerous or definitely something went wrong, but in other words, that's a clue. That's a huge clue. What have we heard about that?
Nothing. Not a thing. And I love your mind, because I love how you think, meaning you're going into a situation where most people very tunnel vision, where you're looking for everything that has a meaning, and it could just be the smallest thing. And
correct.
And in fact, even the last words of the cockpit, I think, were the good night Malaysia 370, 370. Now, when you hear something like that, is that something like, was there anything around like the tone or timing or wording of that transmission that investigators may have overlooked? Or
well, I think the general public has overlooked it. I'm not privy to the investigation other than the report that they publicly released. But report that they released was essentially, we don't know what happened.
Right.
In fact, what's key to that last transmission is that a different person is making the transmission throughout the takeoff, up to cruise, change of handover change from the air traffic controllers in Malaysia to the air traffic controllers in Vietnam. One person is making the radio calls. That's the way it works. One pilot flies, one pilot monitors.
Right.
Or, is the pilot not flying, I guess they call it now. The pilot not flying is the pilot working the radio. So who's flying the airplane? We know that it's Captain Zahari. We know it because the first officer is calling on the radio. Last call. We know that Zahari is not flying any longer because he's on the radio. So that's critical.
Oh, wow.
It tells us that the first officer is now in command of the airplane. Why? Why does he hand it over to the first officer? Any number of reasons.
Wow.
But one reason could be that we're 45 minutes an hour, 2 hours really from the time the pilots enter the cockpit and begin their flight preparations and push back and all that. 2 hours. There's a man in his 50s who is a smoker and a coffee drinker who might need to go to the bathroom. I mean, I don't think that that's like an outrageously speculative thing.
Right.
And if he's going to the bathroom, he's turned control of the aircraft over to the first officer. And why not? It's his last flight before he becomes the first officer's last flight before he becomes fully qualified on the 777. He's in cruise. He's already connected to Vietnam Air Traffic Control. So he's, he can leave.
Right.
He can go get another cup of coffee. He can go to the bathroom. He can do whatever the hell he wants and to come back in. So what is a pilot supposed to do when left alone in the cockpit? I mean, these rules change from country to country. But when left alone in the cockpit, the first officer or the captain, whoever it is left alone, first thing, put on their oxygen mask.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh, yes. That's a requirement. And the requirement is there because should anything happen, this guy or gal needs to have his full or her full cognitive function. And if you don't have your oxygen mask on and you're at 32,000 feet,
right.
boom, pretty quickly you're going to sound like, the drunk at the party.
Right.
So all of these things are, as I want to be very clear, because I have no inside information. I'm looking at what is available. That if the captain had left the cockpit for whatever reason and left the first officer in charge, this would be totally normal and in keeping. But if something had happened, this very young man who was on the verge of getting qualified on a brand new airplane would have been the one thing between life and death. And that, I think, is a very important fact. And we know it, at least part of it, we know he was flying the airplane from that call. Wow. Good night, Malaysia 370.
Especially if this happened where he was in the cockpit by himself, I would think he would be extra cautious, extra alert, because, this was a moment that, one day away. And how fast, you said something real quick, you said about quickly that if something happened, not having the oxygen mask on, how fast does that take if would it have start affecting the pilot's
cognitive function?
Yeah.
Yes. So at 32,000 feet, there's a table. It's called the table of useful consciousness.
Right.
The time of useful consciousness tables, and they show 45 seconds.
Wow!
Before you really start to see a change in cognitive function.
That's quick.
Now, I want to say that the tables, when I wrote the book, they may have been updated in the 10 years since, but the tables of useful consciousness, even at that time, when I was writing the book in 2015, were considered out of date. So the 45 seconds was considered to be, by many aviation physicians, to be a little bit off, and that in fact it's probably less. But that's useful consciousness. Useful consciousness is not on again, off again like a light. It's you start to feel a little and a little more and a little more and a little more. I remember I did, and I talk about it in the book. I did a high altitude chamber flight in which you go into this fancy, capsule, and they start to give you start to give you a higher altitude, and you're not wearing a mask, and they give you documents to fill out, start doing math problems, blah, blah,
that's
blah.
Pretty cool.
And I remember I was thinking, oh, I'm feeling pretty good. I can add 3 plus 3. I can write my name. And the next thing I know, there was somebody waking me up. I had, in other words, I went out like that. I do not remember going out. I remember being woken up. So whatever my time of useful consciousness was, it was 25,000 feet. I think it was a minute or more for sure. I think it might be on my YouTube channel, but it was a minute or more before I actually, boom, lost it. But how much was my cognitive function leading up to the time that I actually went unconscious? Maybe 30 seconds.
That's amazing. Wow.
Yeah. It's a very important, for some airlines, it's very important that their pilots get that kind of training. We don't do that in the United States, but military pilots have had that. It's required for military pilots. So what's interesting is that when I did my high altitude chamber visit in writing the book, I was there with the pilot cadets for EVA Airlines, which is the Taiwanese airline. And they do a lot of long haul flights. And so their pilots are required. So I was there, with a room full of young pilot cadets, all of whom were awake longer than me.
I think that would be interesting to try. But I'm sure it's pretty scary. Like you said, all of a sudden you wake up and you're like, what just happened?
You're only scared before.
I'm sure.
Because you're thinking, are they going to notice me? Like, they're not going to decide they're going to, check their messages.
Right. He made me cough on that one. This conversation is so fascinating just because we've heard so many theories and especially conspiracy theories. But one thing I do want to see if you could elaborate on is the satellite login event where the satellite system rebooted. And I think it was at 2:25 a.m.
Sorry, go ahead.
But I'm curious to see if you can elaborate on that, because that, to me, that would be somewhat of a clue of potential issues.
Correct. So it is a huge clue. I mean, it's a huge clue.
Yeah.
And in fact, the satellite logged off and back on twice.
Oh.
We only know about the second one. I mean, I shouldn't say we only know. It's out there. It's not that it's private information, but it's just not a lot of publicity. But right around the time, and we don't know the on or the off time exactly, but we know, generally speaking, around the time things were going wrong on Malaysia 370, that is, after Goodnight Malaysia 370. And the first officer was instructed as to how to proceed on course. Somewhere in that time zone, the airplane satellite turned off. It turned off. And it was off, and since we don't know exactly what time it did turn off, only what time it logged back on, there's no sense of how long it was. Was it 20 minutes? Was it 40 minutes? We don't know. And I explain it better. I'm not so good with numbers, but it's in my book. I explain better the time frame and why we don't know exactly what it is. But it turns back on again. Now, there's only a few reasons why that airplane would have lost its satellite transmission and logged back on again. One of them is the plane is flying upside down, because that would mean that the antenna is down and, the satellite's up, and there's something big in the way. Okay, that's kind of obvious. But the other would be some sort of electronic malfunction that actually switched off the bus that connects to the satellite. But whatever that malfunction was, turned back on again. And then the plane proceeds to fly. Now we know, generally speaking, how it flew, turned back south, headed west, headed a little bit north, and then headed south into the South Indian Ocean. This is all known. But then, right before this plane runs out of fuel, it turns off again. The other reason it would turn off is because there's no power to the engines. And why would there be no power to the engines? because there's no more fuel.
Wow.
So we know it happened twice. The second one, okay, fine. It makes sense. Of course, it didn't have satellite. It was dying.
Right.
But the first one, why do we have it happen the first time? That is key. And that information is not sitting there in the Indian Ocean. It's in Inmarsat, it's in maintenance records, it's everywhere else. We need to plumb the depths of that question. And in the Crash Detectives, I do. I talk about other accidents or near accidents in which power to the satellite is turned off. And then I talk about a particular one in which that satellite, all power to the airplane is lost on a 747 on landing, but they get power back before they land,
Right.
which triggered an investigation. This was a Qantas flight. And I believe, if my memory is correct, it's a 747. It's in the book. So there's an investigation because no, it was in Thailand. It was a Qantas flight landing in Thailand. So the Australian regulators are like, that's not good. We need to know why we lost electric on this airplane. And so they go in and they do an investigation. And as it turns out, they discover that they lost electronics on the aircraft because there was directly below the electronics bay, where all the, I think of it as the brain of the airplane, directly above the electronics bay, it's called the E&E bay, is the galley, kitchen for business class. And water was leaking from the sink into the E&E bay. And so there was water dripping into the bay and causing a short circuit. And that remedied during the Qantas flight. But as the investigators are looking into this, they want to see, well, heck, as I said in the beginning of our conversation, has this happened before? And sure enough, it had.
Oh.
They found 5 instances in which this had happened.
Wow.
And so I reached out to a friend of mine who works on wide-body jets. He's a mechanic. And I asked my friend, have you ever heard of this? Like water in the E&E bay? Oh, sure, he says, Christine. There's tracks that run in the, around the top of the E&E bay to catch water just to prevent this kind of thing. But sometimes it doesn't actually work. But it's not so uncommon. We've discovered that in maintenance. And I'm like, wow, that's pretty impressive. I didn't know that. I'm telling you about 2 days later, he sends me a video. He says, I'm like, was there some library you found this video? He said, no, a plane just came in, had this problem, so I took this video for you.
Wow, what a coincidence, right?
Is it a coincidence or does it happen more often?
I was going to say.
That's the question. That's the question. So when you say what a coincidence, that's an investigator says, is it a coincidence?
So this happens
or
more than...
Or do we have a larger problem?
Yeah.
And so we go back to your original question, where do you start? Well, you start by looking at everything and think, how does this happen? When does this happen before? What were the consequences? What would have happened if that happened on this airplane?
Wow. I know Captain Shaw had 18,000 hours of flight hours and was very well experienced. So if this catastrophe happened, he would definitely have the experience to figure out the recovery versus the co-pilot. But like you said, if he was incapacitated and the co-pilot was having this issue, he may not have the experience to create this. Because we talked about how many directions this plane has started going. What was the time period? We talked about an hour or so in to until it disappeared, correct?
I think we're at an hour 7, but don't. I would rather not say specifically. It's in the book.
Right.
A lot of facts in the book. A lot of years behind me.
Right. So,
but it's in there. But to your point, I agree with you 100%. I think if Zahari was in the cockpit, if there were 2 pilots in the cockpit,
right,
I think it is far more, my theory would be less, would be weakened by that.
Right.
But I don't think he was. And the reason I don't think he was is because he was no longer flying the airplane.
Yeah.
And the evidence suggests that after 2 hours, he might have gotten out to stretch his legs. It's the perfect time, in other words. That's when, a pilot can feel free to leave the,
Right.
to leave the cockpit for whatever necessities they have. That said, I will not, I don't think it negates the theory if he was in the cockpit, because when I talk about Helios Flight 527, which is the scenario that is most like Malaysia 370, this was an accident that happened in 2005, and the plane was leaving from Cyprus, headed to Athens. Both of the pilots in the cockpit were experienced. This was a 737. They were both there. The masks dropped, so they knew they had a pressurization problem. They call that the rubber jungle, when the rubber jungle comes down. So they knew that they had a pressurization problem. Neither one of them put on their mask. Instead, they decided to figure out, well, what's happening here? So they get on the radio to their operations desk in Cyprus, and they're like, we're getting this warning horn, and we're not sure what's wrong here. I mean, it's kind of a cascade of crazy events on that flight, because the warning horn is the warning horn that you've lost cabin pressurization.
Yeah.
So why did they not know that?
I would say, if I was the captain, hey, co-pilot, put your mask on and I'll make you would think
Neither
somebody.
one of them did. The rules require them to.
Wow.
First thing you do, mask. Second thing you do, descend.
Yeah.
Not troubleshoot. You don't troubleshoot.
Right. Yeah. You're playing with people's lives.
A car's coming to hit you. Okay, you're in the road and a car's coming.
You swerve.
You don't try and figure out, well, where's the nearest crosswalk?
Right.
So that's the thing. So what my point in bringing up the Helios flight, I mean, there's a lot of parallels between the Helios flight and Malaysia 370. But my point in bringing it up is that there were two experienced airmen in the plane. They didn't do what they should have, and they flew on until they both passed out. The airplane continued to fly on its programmed route until it ran out of fuel and hit a mountain. It's the Malaysia 370 story all over again.
Yeah.
I just think that the difference between those pilots and the pilots on Malaysia 370 is that Zahari was so far more experienced. I mean, I bring it up in the book. He had nearly as many hours as Sullenberger with 10 less years of flying experience. I mean, the guy, and not only that, Sullenberger, great pilot, no arguments there. But not only did Captain Zahari fly airplanes all the time, when he wasn't flying for Malaysia Airlines, he was flying the simulator. Loved the simulator, made videos on how to fly the simulator. He built his own simulator.
Wow.
And then when he wasn't sim flying and sharing his sim flying on YouTube, he was flying radio-controlled airplanes.
Wow.
I mean, the guy was like, you look up aviation nut in the dictionary.
He would be there.
His picture would appear. So that's why I suspect he was not in the cockpit. I think he would have done the right thing. But I think the 27-year-old first officer, Farik, I don't believe. I think it's a lot easier to imagine that he made that mistake.
Do you feel like, and I'm sure this has come up many times, how do you rule out a suicide, like a suicide mission, that the co-pilot, maybe the captain did get up and walk out, he locks the door, my life sucked,
right.
And how do you rule that out? And did you do research on the backgrounds of the mental state of both pilots?
I did no research on the mental state. I shouldn't say I did know, but when I was working for ABC, which is ABC News was the reason I was there in the first place, we did actually do a report, as I recall, and we went out and talked to some people. But it's not that's not a difficult conclusion to make, and here's why. The world was trying to figure out whether these guys were suicidal.
Right.
And I never saw any reporting that indicated they were. And the difference was was either shortly before or shortly after. I don't remember now, but it's in the book. When the German Wings flight was intentionally crashed, and that young guy, captain left, first officer, put the airplane into a descent. When they looked, they were half an hour into the flight. Half an hour into the investigation before they discovered this kid had depression. Clinical depression. He'd been given prescription for his depression. And as I describe it in the book, sick isn't subtle.
True.
And I think had either of these gentlemen been capable of murder-suicide, it would have emerged.
Yeah.
But really, 12 years has passed, or 10 years has passed.
Yeah.
12 years, sorry.
12 years.
12 years has passed, and it hasn't. So I just don't think, and it's exceedingly rare. That's the other part. When you look at the history of aviation and say, well, how many times has a pilot taken an airliner, intentionally to commit suicide? It's very few. I list them in the book. So, yeah, it could be that. There's just very little evidence to support it. So I'm not saying it didn't happen, but I think there's much more evidence to indicate the hypoxia, which happens a lot more frequently, 40 times a year, according to the Australians who did the research. Just how many times does hypoxia that could potentially cause incapacitation occur? 40 to 50 times a year. Well, try those odds versus how many times is a pilot likely to take an airliner into the side of a mountain.
Right.
And can I say one more thing? I not to belabor this, but if you're going to kill yourself, do you think you're going to set your watch for let's do this in 7 hours?
No. I'd probably just say get it over with as soon as possible. Unless you just don't have the nerve. Because I've read, and seen documentaries on similar things like this, but not to this extent. But still, that's a lot of lives that you take with you. I think these mass shooters that they kill all these people and they kill themselves. I'm like, why don't you just kill yourselves? I don't understand why you try to take all these people with you. So
hard to wrap your mind around it. But I would think of the people I know, and I know a lot of people. Of the people I know, it seems to me that it would be hard for me to imagine that any of them are capable of mass murder,
right?
And it's never shown up.
True.
But listen, I'm not saying it didn't happen.
Well, I know our time's getting short here, but after years of research and studying aviation disasters, was there any single unanswered question about MH370 that keeps you awake at night, or even other ones that you still you think about and still kind of go back and try to find new information that really stand out to you?
Both of the books I've written about mysterious airplane crashes, the first was TWA 800, in which there's just no evidence to suggest that this didn't happen, is exactly or very close to the way the NTSB described it, which was a design flaw on the 747. So it's kind of funny that my books seem to be about accidents that still have questions around them. But I think the most frustrating part of the Malaysia 370 investigation is the old adage they say in journalism, don't let facts get in the way of a good story.
Right.
There's so many facts that just don't work with the pilot, murder-suicide. They don't work with this plane was hijacked to Diego Garcia, that they don't work, and yet they're still I'm still sort of batting them away. Right. But the truth that nobody seems to get, and it is a truth, is there has been no thorough investigation of what we know. What we know. It's if you're 50% that this could have happened. I'm not saying write a report and say it did happen. I'm saying let's take it as a lesson and see whether this is a problem on the next airplane, because that's the only reason you do accident investigations. It's not so that Tony Sweet can get on his podcast and tell the world. It's not so Christine Negroni can write books. It's not so the family can have closure. These things are nice, and in my case, interesting. In your case, interesting.
Right.
But the reason we do aircraft investigations is to fix problems we didn't know existed. Now, if I'm right about the hypoxia, about the vulnerability in the electronics bay that could have caused the power to go off, if I'm right about pilots not routinely putting on their oxygen masks, because my unscientific survey shows they don't, if I'm right about any of these things, and it's a possibility, then the aviation safety authorities ought to be acting on those things, and they're not. And they're not doing it. And this is where I say to the accident investigation community, of which I am a member, I say, stop wanting the perfect. Work on the good. You don't have to sum it up and say, this is what happened.
Right.
You have to sum it up and say, this could have happened, and therefore let's address it. Pilot hypoxia, whether pilots get hypoxia training, whether the rules are sufficiently incorporated to how long can go between you. How long can go between you? Now that's completely inarticulate. How long an airplane should fly without tracking. Those numbers have been reduced. It was every 30 minutes, which is what made finding Malaysia 370 so difficult. But that sort of thing. How these oxygen bottles are installed. Are they tested correctly when they go back in? All of these are things I address in the book. All of these are actual live problems, potential problems that nobody in the aviation safety world is talking about. Wow. And they ought to be. Because there's no definitive answer. And until they find the damn plane, they're not gonna. Right. And that's wrong. That's wrong.
Well, you have been a joy to talk to. I can sit and listen to you all day. I know people are like, what? But I think this is important because, again, in my field, and when something like this happens, we go to the conspiracy theories, and there's it was shot down, it was a murder suicide, it was, flown to another country, and, all these things. So I love to have you on, and because this is the anniversary, tomorrow, or I think the 8th is the anniversary of 16 years. So, and I think people will really enjoy your books, and you can go to her website right here on the screen. If not, it's ChristineNegroni.com, and that's NEGRONI.com. And there's the books. I'm sure you can get them on Amazon. You can get them on her website. And you can follow her also on Instagram, where she can probably show you all her grandkids and everything else like that. But Christine, thank you so much. You've been a joy, and I hope to have you back again one day. Hopefully, it's not a new crash, but
no, but maybe there'll be some development in Malaysia 370.
That would be amazing.
Or we'll talk about Air India. That's it's a date. It's a date. So, but thank you so much. I love that you had given some thought to your questions, and thank you very much for asking intelligent questions and giving me the opportunity to talk about my theory.
Of course, anytime. And thank you, everybody, for being here. I hope you support Christine and getting her books, and we hope that you all enjoyed this show and every show every Friday right here on Truth Be Told and on the Club Paranormal Network. And until next time, take care of yourself and each other.